Welcome back, Vienna. It's so nice to have you back in studio again. And this time we're going to talk about the fantastic work you do, but this time you have a book. So I'm so thrilled about it. Your first book, congratulations, The Origins of You. Beautiful, beautiful cover. Biggest congratulations. It's a big deal
Thank
to write a
you.
book. It's a
It's a
big deal
big
to have that first
deal.
one. Yeah, it's so good.
Yes, it is. It
How do
is.
you
I'm
feel?
excited.
How do you feel about it?
I'm really excited. When I finished, I did the audio recording of my book a few weeks ago in January. And when I finished reading the book, I had this moment of, I'm sad it's over. Like there was this part that's like, I think I can do this again. And then and I know you've written
Uh,
many books,
yeah,
but it's a funny moment because
it
you go
is.
through the slog, right? Where you're just like,
Oh
oh my
gosh.
gosh, this is
Is this
so
ever going to
hard.
end? Yeah.
Is
Is
this
it ever,
ever
is
going
it
to
worth it?
end?
Yeah.
Exactly. But I love that I'm at this moment where the book is no longer really mine. It goes out to people and people will make it what it needs to be for themselves. And so I'm
Absolutely.
thrilled for it to be out in the world.
Well, I'm so excited for you and big
Thanks.
congratulations. And you are a licensed family therapist. And so I want you just to start by telling people a little bit about you and why you've written this book, because we're going on about the book, but people need to know what's in this book. So if you don't mind
Right.
starting just tell us, and for my listeners that haven't heard you before, who
Sure.
you are, what you do, and why you've written this book.
Right. Yeah. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I work with individuals, couples, and families, all within the context of relationships. And my focus is really understanding the families that we grew up in and around. Sometimes we have one, sometimes we have multiple. So the
Yeah.
exploration of our family of origin, those family systems, and how that all shapes it's the foundation, it's the framework, it's our first
Yeah.
education for pretty much everything. Obviously, there are other influences in our lives, but the family is where we learn
Mm.
how to communicate, how to navigate conflict, how to set a boundary, how we feel and think about ourselves and others, how to love and be loved, right? And so, really diving into those frameworks and understanding the origin stories, right? The firsts in our lives. That is where I spend a lot of my time. For folks present day, it's like when we have these unwanted patterns in our adult lives, whether it's the same conflict over and over with a partner or a parent,
Yeah.
whether it's dating emotionally unavailable people time and time again, whether it's being chronically unhappy in every job that you hold. Right? It's like when you can't shake a behavior, right? When you're like, okay, I want to change this, I want to shift this. But if you can't, if you keep finding yourself back there, my perspective is that we need to look at the origin pain and wounds that are running the show and kind of creating these patterns in our adult lives that we can't seem to shift on our own.
I love so much what you've said. And the work that I do is also, with all the sort of neuroscience behind all this stuff and mind brain body connection. And it's so vitally important that you talk about this, because we can't just put a band-aid on the wound. And that's really what I love about your work, is that you go to the source, and we've got to go to the source. And I know sometimes when people think, we show up in a certain way because, people sometimes just think it's so much work to get there. Isn't there some quick
Mm-hmm.
fix? And in our
Mm-hmm.
current climate of psychiatry and biomedical model, it's all about, you've depressed, you've got to take a pill kind of thing. But that's not the solution. What you're saying is do the work of go and find, if you've got a pattern, you
Mm-hmm.
need to go, there's a reason, and
Yeah.
go find that reason and the family. So you've focused quite heavily in your work around the patterns in the family and how they translate. So can you explain how you see that playing out, maybe with some examples? Maybe we should start with an example, because you've got
Sure.
lots of stories in your book of people, you've given case studies and you've given practical exercises and all kinds of things. So
Yeah.
maybe let's dive in with a story and as an example, and then we can dive a little deeper. Does that sound like a
Absolutely.
good plan?
Yeah, it's a great plan. I want to quickly just say, like, we
Go ahead.
always understand why it's hard to look back, right? It's like so many of my
Yeah.
clients come into therapy and we call it the presenting problem, as you know. And the idea of like, here's the thing that I'm struggling with today. I want to keep my eyes on the prize and I want to find a solution. And like you said, a quick fix. And we can spend a little bit of time there. But when the quick fix isn't working, right? Like that's where we turn around and take a look at the past. It's hard stuff though, because because people are really nervous about opening up Pandora's box. They don't want to, we worry about, we've gotten our relationship with a family member to a certain point at this point in our lives, and we don't want to disrupt that. We idealize childhood and we don't want to disturb that. And we also sort of hold this narrative that our parents did the best that they could with what they had. And so a lot of times we will rationalize and explain away the pain. And so, yes, context, of course, is important. And we can see people through a lens of compassion and grace, which I highly recommend. And it cannot be the excuse for our pain. So
that's really good. Can I ask you a quick question around that? I think that's so important that you contextualize it like that, that it is hard to look back and it's hard to go through that change. And as you say, sort of idealizing childhood and our parents doing the best in there, that is still, that's so valid. But at the same time, you can honor that space, but you can also say, well, that was a space, but it did impact me. So it's actually okay to honor that space and then say, okay, but there was an impact. I need to work on the impact. And I think, I wanted to ask you, so I want to ask you this question. I think with the whole social media explosion, you can get as much therapy. You literally don't have to go to therapy almost. I mean, you can go online and you can get all the advice that you need. Obviously, never replaces that good, good interactive therapy. But the thing is that there's a lot of move towards it's my parents' fault and early childhood. And it's great that we're talking about these things, but do you have an opinion around maybe there's a shift too much about the blame side and, victim and that can keep us stuck as well? Because I think I heard you say, let's keep a balance. Let's acknowledge our parents, but let's also look at impact. Correct me if I'm wrong, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really explicit about it in the book, that this isn't a book about throwing our parents or the adults in our lives under the bus, right? This is about understanding the story and absolutely that balance of grace and compassion. Right at the end of the book, I talk about something that Michael Kerr, psychotherapist, says about filial loyalty, of seeing our parents outside of just mommy and daddy, right? And this exercise of thinking about your mother as your grandmother's daughter and see how the perspective shifts. And I love that inquiry, right? I love that exercise because, again, we are reminded that the people in our lives were once tiny humans who have a rich history, who have a complex story, who grew up in their own family systems and have wounds of their own. And when we can see it through that lens of like, oh yeah, you've had this human experience too, right? And so I have a tenderness with you, but that tenderness cannot be an excuse, right? So that balance of grace and compassion with ownership, accountability, right? Responsibility, right? That's the intersection of this work. We don't have to hate people. We don't have to throw them under the bus. We don't have to point a finger and place blame. In fact, I would say that that's often something that just keeps us stuck in the cycle, right? Is that at some point we need to become agents in our own lives to say, yes, this is what happened. And now I am the person who's responsible for my healing. Because when we outsource our healing, right? It's like, that's where we will stay stuck because sometimes people can acknowledge us and sometimes people can apologize from a heartfelt place. But what I find more times than not is that they can't. And so we get stuck in this place wishing that once my mother acknowledges this, then I will feel good. And that's where we have to shift away from that. So yeah, I think that balance, is so important to hold. And to know that we're not going in trying to bash our families here at all.
Thank you for saying that and for saying it so beautifully, because it is that there's a tendency. And I think, it's always like that. We become aware, we've suppressed things for years, and then suddenly there's a zeitgeist of, trauma, the past, that really, we finally acknowledging that the past does impact our future. And then there's a shift too much in one direction. And then we kind of bring the balance back again. So that's really something, that's why I brought that up, because I saw this in your book. And I know from talking to you that you have a very nice balanced approach. So I love that. We've got to look at the past, but we've got to honor what they've gone through. Seeing your mother as someone's daughter, I mean, your grandmother's daughter, that's just phenomenal. What a great way of saying it. And then looking at the impact. So you can do two things at once. So you don't get stuck in one, only looking at it in one way. Love that.
That's right. Yeah. So, you were asking for some examples before. So I talk about 5 origin wounds in the book: the worthiness wound,
Yeah,
the
love
belonging
that.
wound, the prioritization wound, the trust wound, and the safety wound. And I opened the book with a story about a client of mine who comes into therapy. She's presenting with trying to figure out whether or not she wants to stay in the relationship with her partner, Clyde. And she comes in and she says, I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't know why, though, because he's this wonderful partner. We're probably about to get engaged, and I need to figure out whether I ought to stay or go. And so we start exploring, and I'm asking questions about, has the other shoe dropped in past relationships? Has the other shoe dropped in your family of origin?
Mm-hmm.
And, funny enough, to our point, she's like, why are we going back there? My family was great. I don't think you're going to find anything there. Why do therapists always do that? And we go on with our therapy for a bit of time. And then eventually in one of our sessions, something opens. And we start talking about this moment when she was a teenager. She was in her dad's room using his computer, and she stumbles across an open email between her father and a woman who's not her mother. And it's revealing all of these affair details that have been going on for a really long time. She had had this image of her father and the family. He's this great man, always home from work, always sitting down for dinner with the family, seemingly loving his wife and his children. And all of a sudden, this image of her father and her family gets shattered. He walks in, he sees her looking at the email. He says, oh my goodness, please don't tell your mother or your sister. I promise I'll cut off the affair. It wasn't until that moment in therapy where she had spoken those words out loud. She had absorbed this secret, or we often talk about family secrets. She had kept it to herself. She had never told her mother. She had never told her sister. And she had held this story internally for, at that point, decades. And what we started to realize was that this rupture in her family of origin so long ago created a trust origin wound, right? She was always waiting for the other shoe to drop in her romantic relationships because it had in her family of origin. And for us listening in, we might say, well, how could she not have seen that, right? Like, how could she not know that an affair in her family of origin would have affected trust in her future relationships? But that's that's what's so interesting about the ways in which we cope with our pain, right? She had absorbed it almost so much that she had forgotten about this moment in her life, because she had to go on for the rest of her time at home, pretending like nothing had happened. She had to cover this secret. She had taken on that role, 1, because her father had asked her, and 2, because she was really scared that revealing the secret would blow up her family. Right. And so it wasn't until she was able to speak that out loud that we could actually begin to tend to the origin pain, right? Instead of us talking about whether she should stay with Clyde or not, whether or not it was a good decision to get married or not, right? Like, because that focus is a distraction, right? It's not actually to the
real core problem,
right? And so that's the work, right? Is to bring ourselves back into the original pain that really wants to be witnessed. It has to first be acknowledged. I walk people through an origin healing practice in the book where that first step is about naming and identifying and acknowledging the wound, right? What wound do I have? And some people who have read the book are like, is it possible to have all 5? Like, you could.
Yes, probably.
Of course.
At some point in your life, for sure. I agree.
Yeah. Yes. But, to actually identify the wound and then to witness it, because so many times we just package it up, put it on the top shelf. We try to find a way to move forward. We've got our coping strategies, our defense mechanisms, all the things that we do to try to move the pain away, right? This concept of time heals all wounds. Okay, let me just put it there and let time pass by, and then I'll be okay. And what we see time and time again is that we have to be able to witness the pain, grieve what's there, and then begin the process of pivoting to new decisions and behaviors, right? And so in our work together, once we were able to do that process, then she could loosen that grip, that fear of the other shoe is going to drop. And it made the decision to stay in a relationship with someone who was a phenomenal partner so much more clear and easy for her.
Wow, that's such a brilliant example. Well, that just makes me immediately want you to talk about all the different wounds. And I can just feel my listeners saying, okay, well, that gets it. So what are these wounds and their origins? So I know that's a huge question, but maybe we could just jump through that.
Sure.
The naming of the wound. So, what do you mean by naming of the wound? And you as you said, you have you've got 3 different parts to the book and you've got the 5 different wounds and whatever. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the first wound that I talk about is the worthiness wound. I'm convinced that probably all of us rub up against this wound at some point. So the worthiness wound has a lot to do with conditions. If you were a performer, a people pleaser, a peacekeeper, if you had to get straight A's or had to be a phenomenal athlete in order to receive love, connection, validation, attention, presence, peace, or calm in your family, right? You started to learn that I needed to show up in a certain way in order to get what it is that I wanted and needed. And if I didn't bring home the A's, or if I wasn't presenting in the way that my family wanted me to, then the love is lost, right? Then there's something that's withheld. Right. And so oftentimes, right, we will become people later on in life who either embody that same kind of way of being, right, where it's like, okay, I'm just going to please everyone so that people like me, right? Or I'm going to be a perfectionist so that I get the validation that I need. So there's a lot to do with the condition there. I talk about this in my book, Bless My Father. He's like, what chapters am I in?
Oh,
Where do you talk about me?
Oh, I think every person who writes about this sort of thing, their parents are worrying, oh gosh.
I know. Where do I show up?
You've got a great story too, which you can maybe filter in. I mean, you're probably going to do that now. So
yeah. Well, I want to filter in a little bit of it because at a point in my life, my father, who has grown since, was very conditional with his love. So when I behaved the way that he wanted me to, when I was easygoing, when I was showing up in the way that he preferred, he was so helpful. He was very present. He was very active in my life. He would help me out, lots of acts of service. He could go to the grocery store and pick up a few things for me if I needed them, that type of thing. But the moment that I became someone he did not like, right? And this could be in my teenage years, my early 20s, he would punish by shutting down and withholding, right? So oftentimes he would spend days or even weeks giving me the silent treatment.
Wow.
And that silent treatment was, I learned that if I was a certain way, right, the condition was behave this way, present this way, and then you get this from me. And if you step out of that, then you don't. And then love and connection and help, support is taken away from you. This was a fascinating thing for me to realize because I think, and it plays into a role that I took on in my family system pretty early on too, but it really supported that because as an adult, I started to realize that I believed that I was really only worthy of love, being stayed with, being chosen when I was easygoing, essentially needless, right? I was this needless little girl. My parents went through a 9-year divorce process starting when I was in first grade. And I took on the role of being the needless little girl because they were crashing and burning around me. There was so much conflict. There was so much chaos going on. And I had decided that the best way to move through this was by being fine, being unaffected by it all, just kind of flying under the radar. And that needless little girl who's like, oh, if I need something, it's going to be way too much for them. It's going to put too much pressure on the system. And listen, whether or not that was true, it didn't matter. They might have said, no, absolutely, we had room for you. But that was the way that I was internalizing.
That's how you perceived it, yeah.
That's how I perceived it. That's how I was internalizing it. It was really fascinating to see how that needless little girl turned into a needless woman who also presented as having no needs, being unaffected by anything. And as I just said, with the worthiness wound, that really reiterated to me, don't have needs, be easygoing, fly under the radar. That's when you are likable, lovable, choosable. And when you are difficult, that's when love is withheld, that's when it's stripped away from you. That's when it's taken, right? And so it really continued to condition that part that said, just be easygoing, don't speak up, just fly under the radar, pretend like things are fine, even when they're not, right? And so I want people to think about, what were the conditions of love, right? What are the things that made me feel like, who did I need to be? What did I need to do in order to feel worthy of love, connection, presence, validation, attention as a start point?
Wow. Very good. That's amazing. And you talk about, the 9 years of the needlessness that grew into your adulthood. How did that impact your own marriage?
Yeah. Well, so before, I had this massive breakthrough in my late 20s. I was dating someone at the time. His ex came back into the picture. She wanted to be back with him, and he was deciding whether or not he wanted to get back into a relationship with her or stay in the relationship with me. And I became, of course, unsurprisingly, this person who said, well, absolutely take all the time you need. I totally understand. You must be going through so much, right? I became this overly understanding person and boundaryless, pretending like I was unaffected by the fact that they were talking so much, spending time together. And I remember having a conversation with a friend, and it all clicked in. It's like, oh my goodness, right? The role that I took on as a child is the same role that I am in my adult relationships.
Wow.
Unsurprisingly, again, I had never broken up with someone until this point. No partner. I was always the person who had been broken up with. It's hard to break up with people when you pretend like everything's fine, right? It makes sense.
Exactly.
Right. But I remember being like, I am actually not okay. And this is not respectful. And I am deeply affected by what's going on. And I remember picking up the phone, my palms are sweating. I have a pit in my stomach. My heart is racing, beating out of my chest. And I say, I'm actually not okay with what's going on. And I feel so affected by this. This doesn't feel respectful. And I'm going to exit. And that moment was such a profound moment. When I look back, and again, maybe even some listeners are like, that feels like not that big of a deal. But when you've been doing something, when you've been doing something for decades, and then all of a sudden you try saying, I'm not okay, when you've always said you're fine, it is life-changing. And that's not hyperbolic, right? It's life-changing when you try something different for the first time. And it was both this empowering moment for me, but also like, I was crying on the floor for 2 months afterwards. It's like, it's not just impact. It was an impact. And it's not just like, I told him, and now my head is held high. It was like, I did a really hard thing that is so powerful for me, and I'm still in pain, and this is still hard, and there's still grief there, right? So it's not that when we make these pivots and these shifts in our lives, that all of a sudden we're like, oh, this is amazing. And then the soundtrack comes on and the sun is shining down on you, right? It's like sometimes it's really hard, and it's in the grueling kind of very difficult moments where you still choose that. And so this was such a beautiful shift for me. You talk about my partner now, my husband. He loves to joke. He's like, I never met that woman. You are certainly the person who is absolutely able to say how you're feeling at all times and what you like and don't like. And so we get a good chuckle out of that. But
that's amazing. That is amazing. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it just shows that when you make one shift, like that you start to set the new tracks for the behavior. Right. You're like, I survived it.
You survived it. You also explained something there that I want to just hone in on it, because it's something that in our research, it's something that's come up such a lot, and I call it the treatment effect. And it's when you're progressing forward, you're actually going to feel like you're going backwards. I mean, we all know this, and as a therapist, you've got to prepare your patients for this, and your clients and so on. But it's something that we don't really come to grips with when we're in the midst of that moment. And you said that so clearly. It was pivotal, life-changing, not hyperbolic. It was an actual thing, but you were on the floor crying for 2 months. So in some people's minds, that may think, hey, it made you go backwards. No, that was progress forward. That the ability to feel that pain, the ability to grow into that new person, that you were grieving all the years that you were the needless person. There was so much, and that's progress. Isn't
Right.
it? I mean, that's
It's
the
so
progress.
well
So
said.
crying on the floor was the progress. That's the
Yes.
treatment effect. It gets worse before it gets better. So
Yeah, it's so beautifully said. And I think it's so important for people to hear because we're like, healing, this destination. And like when you're doing it, it's this beautiful thing. It's like,
not at
no,
all.
not at all. It's hard. And you're right. We step to the side, we step back, we take a step forward. Like you can feel like you're going in a weird direction. I think a lot of times people have this fear too, that as they grow, does the pool start to shrink if you're thinking about dating, right? And so it's like, there's so many things that want to pull us back into, okay, this is what's familiar. This is what I know. This is what's easy. But I love how you're describing this, that, it's a dance and there are going to be steps forward and backwards. And I recently had a session with a client of mine. She was really upset with herself because she knew she ought to have left a relationship a few weeks earlier, and she'd stayed maybe 6 weeks longer. She's like, I knew better. I should have left. I overstayed. And I said, whoa, hang on real fast. This is a person who had historically overstayed in relationships for 10 years. And so it was so important to stop her in that moment of spiraling into this self-critic of how come I didn't do this and I'm not, on my growth path. And she received it. It was like, growth is not always about choosing the pattern right away in a different way. Sometimes it's about exiting a relationship just a bit sooner. Sometimes it's about noticing something a little bit sooner. Like we have to be able to see growth through many different lenses. And if it's just, I should have done this in this moment, and we can't see that, but you left in 6 weeks instead of 10 years, right? Like we have to be able to acknowledge the different ways that growth and healing show up. So thank you for reiterating that.
No, that's really good. I'm glad that you gave that example as well. It's really good because it's when you're in the midst of the stuff, you don't see those things. And that's why having these discussions is so important, because it gives a different angle. And you've really dropped so many pearls of wisdom. So thank you. It's been fantastic. Okay, let's dive into some of the other wounds.
Okay.
And you can, so the one we've done, I want to feel worthy. And then I want to belong, the next one.
I want to belong. Yeah. So a lot of families have this narrative of, this is what it means to be in our family. This is what we believe. This is what we do. This is how we love, right? And there's lots of beautiful stuff, right? When family systems have traditions, right? Like that's lovely. But there's also an element to it where if you don't adapt to who we are, what we do, what we believe, then you're going to be on the outside, right? And so oftentimes this is a part of what creates the origins of a belonging wound. You're obviously familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate. He talks about how authenticity and attachment are the two lifelines, right? As kiddos, we need those things. But when attachment is threatened, we will drop authenticity in order to save connection. So when we're tiny little humans, right, and attachment is threatened, right, then we have got to become whatever we need to do, right? However we need to shapeshift. However it is, we need to belong, right? Because belonging must be it, right? And when we're tiny, belonging isn't authenticity, right? Belonging is fitting in, being a part of something, being accepted by the system around us. And so we will adapt in those early stages if attachment is threatened, if we're not believing and doing and showing up in the world in the way that our family requires, whether it's, believing in a particular religion, who you're allowed to love and be loved by, right? There's a lot of different examples in which like this is how our family does that. So if anybody's ever heard that explicitly or even had it implied, right?
It's going to affect.
That's going to have an imprint on the way in which you feel like you belong, right? Can I be authentically myself and still be loved, right? Still be chosen, still have connection, right? With the people I love. I share about a story, a client in my book who is gay and his parents were not able to make much space for that. And so much so that they really started to treat him differently when he came out to them. And, this is obviously a common example. A lot of people have this story.
But it's real.
But it's real, and I think there's, I talk about it in the book where he specifically overheard like his mother saying that he was ruining her life, and okay, they grew up in the South, they small community, lots of shame, fear of judgment from the community around them. And he could understand that, right? He could understand where the limitations were and where the constraints were, but it doesn't change how deeply impactful those words are. He's ruining my life. Right. And he's like, how could me being me ruin your life? Right. It's heartbreaking. And then you start to see how we chase belonging as adults then. We remain inauthentic in order to be accepted, or we can take a path of rebellion, right? Where we're like, screw it. And then I'll be on the outside. I'll be an outsider anyway. But either path, right? It's not integrated, right? Whether we're adapting and losing our authenticity in order to fit in, or fully rebelling to just say, screw this, there's still a lack of true belonging. Right. And that's the work to get to that place of true belonging, which lives inside of ourselves. Right. Authenticity.
Beautiful. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'm so glad that you used the example of someone who's gay, who's gone through what they're going through, because it is such an issue. And thank goodness we've reached a bit of a time period in our history where, being able to talk about these things is more open. Yeah. And I mean, it's a lot more open, but not enough. But it doesn't make the fact that there's still very strong belief systems that block that. And the authenticity thing is just so true, because how many people are sacrificing who they are to belong? It's just, I mean, it's such a great example. And it just it breaks my heart how many children are on the street because they've been kicked out of homes because they're not being accepted for being who they are, which is gay. The whole LGBTQ community. And I just want to honor them in this, as you brought it up, I just want to honor them because it's heartbreaking what has happened.
It is.
And the stories we get told as well, it's heartbreaking. So thank you for using that example. And we honor that pain that people are going through, and we honor your authenticity, anyone in that community. Thanks, Vienna. So did you want to say more about that, or do you want to?
Well, I mean, listen, there's so many examples, right? This is not necessarily one that is strictly within a family system, but I think I mentioned it in the book that obviously society at large deeply affects the sense of belonging.
Right? Religious systems, all kinds of systems.
Right. Religious systems. We have, of course, people of color who oftentimes are having to mold and adapt and shapeshift themselves in order to fit into white communities. We have differences in socioeconomic status. And so I make a mention of like, if you went to a private school, but your family had no money and you were just on scholarship, right? To like have to adapt in order to fit in, right? So we can look at so many different ways in which we're trading our authenticity, and we are finding ways to change and pretend and, essentially code switch in order to feel like we are a part of the group. But it leaves us with a wound there that needs our attention at this point in our lives.
That's so amazing, because I've interviewed so many people lately and who have spoken about like the Happiness Project that Dr. Robert Wickham, the Happiness Project, which has run over 84 years at 750 families. And the core finding in that was community, the need for community. We're so driven by relationship. Right. And we often will sacrifice the relationship with ourselves, because a relationship is not just community. It's two. It's yourself and community. And it's what you've just been describing is how we can sacrifice our own relationship with ourselves in order to belong. So it's almost like the belonging to the community overrides self. We sacrifice self for the community, which is an interesting concept. So to bring that balance back into that is so important.
Yeah.
So it's really good you're speaking about that. It's a huge one.
Yeah. So the next wound is the prioritization wound. And this is when you didn't feel important enough growing up. So oftentimes it might be a parent who's a workaholic, or there might be addiction in the family, or a mental health challenge that's taking up a lot of space. And that is the thing that becomes the priority. It could also be parents' conflict that is so big and all consuming, or it might be, a parent after a divorce who is dating for many years and only speaking about the people that they're dating, and they're so not focused on the child. So, but one of the examples that I want to give for prioritization that I think is really important is that our wounds don't always come from a place of malintent, negligence, abuse. Sometimes it comes from a well-intended parent or family system. And that's really important to identify here. I have a really quick story about a client of mine, Andre, who had a mom who worked double shifts, 2 jobs, except for on Sundays. They would go to church together and have brunch afterwards, and then she would go off to her shift. And he could rationalize that mom working 2 jobs was actually her way of prioritizing him. He loved her, respected her in such deep ways, but still at the end of the day, he craved for more time with her. He craved to be the priority in his life, in her life, through time spent. And I think it's so important to realize that it doesn't always have to come from these awful, abusive, negligent places, right? That sometimes wounds come even when parents are doing their absolute best. It's heartbreaking, but it's still so important to see that there's a wound that can still be created. The trust wound.
And can I ask you a question there? So
Sure.
I think with those kind of situations, it's almost like that Andre would feel guilt about saying, hey, I've got a wound because my mom.
Absolutely.
So there's conflict, but you're allowed to honor and you're allowed to heal.
Yes.
Kind of the two things together. I think that's really a strong message that you're giving people.
Yeah, so important. The trust wound is probably what you expect it to be, right? That there's likely a betrayal, deceit, lies that you either experienced yourself or that you witnessed and observed, right? And so whether it's, I talked about the client at the beginning of our podcast here today who came across the infidelity of her father. So obviously that's one of the common examples of where trust then gets broken. And, there's so many things where being taken advantage of, somebody stealing money from you, taking out credit cards in your name as a child. I mean, there's so many things that can happen here. It doesn't always have to be to you. It can be to somebody else you love that you're just watching it happen. And we go through life and maybe become adults who struggle to trust others. And we're constantly checking our partner's phone or emails to see what's really going on. So that's one of the ways that it could show up. We're on speed racing our way through the wounds. The last one is the safety wound, which, I'm very, very careful and delicate with this wound. I am clear about it in the book as well, that when we're talking about a safety wound, we are also talking about abuse, of course, emotional, psychological, physical, sexual. It's a really tender space. And when we've had when our well-being is not cared for, concerned for, about, respected and honored, right? That's when we don't feel safe and secure in the world, right? That's when a safety wound can be born. And when it's the adults in our lives who are not protecting us, who are not seeing us, who don't have the care and concern for us to make sure that we are protected and safe, right? And so it's very easy to go through life then feeling like I am not safe. Nobody is thinking about me. Nobody does have care. People are going to take advantage of me, right? And oftentimes with a safety wound, those walls go high, high, high up. I know we won't probably get too far into it today, but in the third section of the book, I talk about how the wounds then play out in the breakdown in communication, conflict, and boundaries. And so when we are protecting ourselves at all costs, then the wall goes all the way up, and that blocks our ability for connection, intimacy, closeness with others. And when we're talking about restoring some of these, we do have to take risks. Unfortunately, we can't get through this work without taking risks. There are no human guarantees. We cannot make promises. Sometimes people say after an infidelity, for example, promise me you'll never cheat. That is not going to repair your wound. I promise you that. Those words will not change the wound for you. This is about eyes wide open risk taking, right? This is not about a recklessness. I share an Ernest Hemingway quote in the book who says the best way to know if you can trust somebody is by trusting them. This is not meant to be reckless. This is about that eyes wide open risk taking. And we can do that when we understand ourselves, when we understand the people we are in relationship with, when we see the bigger picture, and then we can gradually, step by step, begin to move through through communication, conflict, and boundaries so differently than the ways that we were either taught or the ways in which we do it as a way of protecting ourselves that somehow still ruptures things in the relationship.
Oh, that's so beautifully put. Well, Vienna, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. It's fantastic. It's a great book. It's very easy to read. This is the book, The Origins of You, and it's incredibly helpful. It really addresses the most basic fundamental core of understanding who we are and how we play out in relationships and how we can improve that. So thank you so much for your wisdom and for writing this book and for sharing about this on the podcast today. And where can people get hold of you?
Oh, sure. Thank you for having me. You can find me on Instagram at mindfulmft. You can buy that book at anywhere that books are sold. So I'm so excited for people to have it in their hands. And then viennapharon.com is my website. So
fantastic. Well, we'll put all those in the show notes. And thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fantastic discussion and definitely look forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks, Dr. Leaf.